A bolt cutter snapped through a rusted padlock. The metal door rattled up on stiff rollers. Her hands were shaking on the bolt cutters. Dust rolled out and stung her eyes. She stood at the open mouth of the unit in a cheap raincoat, breathing in 40 years of locked-up air. The boxes inside were stacked to the ceiling. Each one was labeled in her husband's neat block handwriting. Each one was sealed with the same brown tape he used on Christmas parcels. She had buried him 11 days ago. She had found the small key taped inside his sock drawer 6 days ago. The widow's name was Margaret. She was 72 years old, and she had no idea who the man she had loved for 50 years had really been. What had he been paying for every single month all that time? Stay with me on this one. The funeral had been small. 41 people in folding chairs at the Lutheran Hall on Birch Street, 2 casseroles in the kitchen, and one short eulogy from a pastor who had only met Harold twice. Margaret had stood at the door in her gray wool coat and shaken every hand. She had not cried in front of any of them. She had cried alone in the car on the way home, 2 short bursts, and then she had wiped her face and gone inside and made herself a pot of tea. That had been 11 days ago. She had given herself 3 days before she touched his things. On the morning of the 4th day, she opened the closet. She did it like she was opening an oven that might be hot. She moved his shirts to one side and folded them, one by one on the bed. She folded them the way he had folded them. Tight corners, sleeves tucked in. She did not stop to smell them. She was afraid that if she stopped, she would not start again. She had been finding things in his pockets for years. Receipts, a loose nail, a neatly folded square of brown paper that he used to write down phone numbers because he hated his cell phone. She had teased him about it for decades. You have the brain of a librarian and the pockets of an old farmer. He had smiled every time. But the sock drawer was different. The sock drawer was where she found the key. It was a small brass key, the kind that fits a brass padlock the size of a child's fist. It was taped to the inside of the wooden divider with a strip of clear tape gone yellow at the edges. There was no note. There was no label. Just the key, hidden where she would only find it if she emptied the drawer all the way. She held it in her palm for a long time. Then she sat down on the edge of the bed, and she breathed slowly through her nose, the way her mother had taught her to do when she was little and scared. The bank statement came later that afternoon. It was sitting on the desk in the den, with all his other monthly papers, in a stack he had marked active in his neat block letters. The transfer was $87 every month on the 15th to a company called Sunshine Self-Storage out near the county road. The transfers went back further than the statement she could find in his desk. She drove down to the bank the next morning and asked them to print the full history. The clerk made her sit in a small room while the printer ran for almost 20 minutes. 40 years. $87 a month. $41,760 paid out without her seeing 1 cent of the bill. He had told her once that he kept their joint account clean and simple because he handled the boring parts. She had let him. She had always let him. Harold had been the kind of man who made sure her car had oil and her glove compartment had napkins. He had paid every bill on the day it came in. He had loved her, plainly and out loud, in front of every neighbor on Birch Street for 50 years. Margaret called her daughter Joanne that night. She did not mention the key. "Mom, you sound tired." "I'm fine, honey. Just sorting through papers. Don't push yourself. There's no rush." She agreed. She said goodbye. She sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea going cold in her hand, and she stared at the brass key on the placemat in front of her. She did not sleep that night. The next morning she dressed in slacks and the cheap raincoat she used for the garden. She put the key in a small zippered pouch. She put a thermos of tea in her tote bag. She put a pair of bolt cutters in the trunk of her car, because she did not know if the brass key still worked or if the lock had been changed without her, and she was not going to drive home empty-handed. Sunshine Self-Storage was a single row of orange roll-up doors out beyond the railway crossing, past the feed store, past the place where the old Methodist church used to be before it burned down in 1979. She drove past it twice before she found the turn. She parked. She sat in her car for half an hour without moving. Then she opened the door, took out the bolt cutters, and walked across the gravel toward the unit number she had copied from the storage company's website. Unit 47. She was going to know. She was 72 years old, and she was going to know. The brass key did not fit. He had changed the lock at some point or replaced it, or maybe the original lock had failed, and he had bought a new one. The bolt cutters did the work in 3 seconds. The padlock fell into the gravel with a heavy clack. The roll-up door went up on its tracks with a sound like a freight train, and the dust came rolling out, and Margaret stood with her hands shaking on the cutter handles and looked into 40 years of her husband's secret. The boxes were stacked from the floor to the corrugated metal ceiling. 4 stacks deep on the left. 4 stacks deep on the right. A narrow path down the middle. At the back, against the rear wall, sat something covered with a heavy blue tarp. She walked in slowly. She did not want to touch anything yet. She wanted to see. The boxes were all the same. Plain cardboard. The kind you order in bundles from an office supply store. Each one was labeled with a year, 1985, 1986, 1987. All the way up to last year. 40 boxes, more or less, organized chronologically like a library, like a tax record, like a museum. She pulled the top box of the first stack down. It was light. She set it on the concrete and lifted the lid. Letters. Maybe 100 letters in white envelopes with green linings, all addressed to H. Pearson, P.O. Box 219, Cedar Junction. That was a town 3 hours north. She had never been there. Harold had said he had gone there once for a fishing trip in the 70s. He had said it so often and so calmly that she had never asked a single follow-up question. Hold on to that detail. She lifted one envelope. The return address was a woman's name. Ruth Garvey. The handwriting was careful and looped, the way women her own age wrote. Margaret sat down on the concrete floor with the envelope in her lap. She did not open it. She stared at it. Her ears were ringing. She did not want to be the kind of woman who tore through a dead man's letters looking for proof of his betrayal. But she was already that woman now. She had brought the bolt cutters herself. There was no going back from the bolt cutters. She opened the envelope. The letter inside was short. The date at the top was March of 1986. The first line said, Mr. Pearson, the money came again this month. Thank you. The boy is doing better. He had pneumonia for a while, but the doctor says he is on the mend. Margaret read it 3 times. She did not understand it. Then she did, and her hands began to shake harder than they had on the cutter handles. She opened another. Then another. She read them out of order. Her back hurt from sitting on the cold concrete. She did not get up. The letters spanned 40 years. They were all polite. They were all addressed to Mr. Pearson. They all said some version of the same thing. The money came. Thank you. The boy is okay. The boy is growing. The boy is in school. The boy is going to community college. The boy is working at a hardware store now. The boy got married. The boy had a son of his own. The boy. Margaret could feel her own pulse in her throat. She got up. Her knees popped. She went to the second stack and pulled down a different box, this one labeled 1992. Inside were more letters, all from the same Ruth Garvey, all about the same boy. There was also a photo album. She opened it. A young woman in a faded blue dress, holding a baby. A toddler on a tricycle. A first day of school photo. A boy in a baseball uniform. A teenager with thick black hair. A young man at a graduation ceremony. A man in his 30s holding a baby of his own. Margaret closed the album. She closed her eyes. She made a sound she did not recognize. She was sure in that moment that she was looking at her husband's other family. She was sure that for 40 years she had been the wife on the front porch, and someone else had been the mother of his real children. She thought of every time he had been late from work, every fishing trip he had taken alone, every quiet evening when he had stared at the television and not really watched it. She felt very old. She stood up too fast and braced one hand against the wall of boxes. She walked slow and stiff to the back of the unit. She lifted the corner of the blue tarp. Underneath was a metal lockbox, the size of a small suitcase, painted gray. It was bolted directly to the concrete floor. There was a small keyhole in the front, a keyhole the size of a brass key. She did not open it. Not yet. She turned around and walked back out of the storage unit into the afternoon sun. She felt the gravel under her shoes. She felt the wind on her face. She felt very strongly that if she opened that lockbox today, she would never sleep again. She walked to her car. She took the thermos out of her tote bag. She poured tea into the little cup that screwed onto the top. The tea was still warm. She sat on the metal step that ran along the front of the storage row, and she drank her tea, and she watched a single brown sparrow hop along the gravel looking for crumbs. The bird hopped close. It was not afraid of her. She did not move. For a long minute the world was just a woman, a sparrow, and a cup of tea in the sun. Her hands had stopped shaking. Her breath had slowed. She watched the bird, and she did not think about the boxes. Then she heard footsteps behind her on the gravel. "Ma'am, you all right?" She looked up. A heavy-set man in a maintenance uniform was standing a few feet away, holding a clipboard. He had a name patch on his chest that said Earl. "I'm fine," she said. "Just sitting." He looked at the open unit. He looked at the cut padlock on the gravel. He looked back at her. "You Mrs. Pearson?" She nodded. "Real sorry about Mr. Pearson. He was a regular here. Quiet fella. Came in every 3 months, always with a couple of boxes, always alone. Paid on time. Never gave us a lick of trouble." He cleared his throat. "I saw the obituary in the paper. Was going to mail you the renewal notice if you did not come." She thanked him. He nodded and walked back toward the office, slow and careful, like a man who knew when to leave a person alone. She sat for another minute. Then she got up. She went back inside the unit. The afternoon light angled in from the door and made a long bright stripe across the concrete. She walked to the lockbox. She took the brass key out of the zippered pouch. Her hand was steady now. She had done the shaking already. She was past that. The brass key turned in the lock with a soft click. She lifted the lid. Inside, on top of everything else, was a single white envelope. On the front, in Harold's neat block letters, were 3 words. "If you find this," she did not read it. Not yet. She lifted it out and set it aside. Beneath it were folders. Maybe a dozen of them. Beneath the folders were the things she would later understand were her husband's secret life, laid out in chronological order. Bank receipts. Money orders. A small black notebook with names and dates. A worn leather wallet she did not recognize. A driver's license with a stranger's face on it. A name. Thomas Garvey. Date of birth, 1944. Now here's the thing. She picked up the envelope marked "If you find this." She opened it. Harold's handwriting filled 4 pages. It started with the date. November 4th, 1985. The night the world had quietly changed for him without her ever noticing. She sat down on the concrete and she read. He had been driving home from a sales call on a county road south of Cedar Junction. The roads had been bad. There had been freezing rain on top of old snow. He had taken a curve too fast. He had seen something dark in the road too late. He had felt the impact through the front of the car. He had stopped. He had walked back along the shoulder. The man on the ground had not been moving. "I should have called for help," Harold had written. "I should have stayed." I sat in the snow with him for almost an hour. The road was empty. There were no other cars. He was already gone. I knew he was gone. And I made the worst decision of my life. I drove home. I told you the car had hit a deer. You bought a new headlight. You were so calm about it. I've never told another living person what I am writing here. Margaret put the page down. She put both hands flat on the concrete to keep herself from tipping over. She picked the page up again. She read on. The man's name had been Thomas Garvey. He had been 41 years old. He had been walking home along the shoulder because his truck had broken down 2 miles back. He had left behind a wife named Ruth, who was 30 at the time, and a son who was 4 years old. The police had ruled it a hit and run. The case had gone cold within a year. Harold had not been able to live with it. So he had done the only thing his cowardice still allowed him to do. He had found Ruth Garvey's address from the newspaper. He had opened a post office box in a different town under a different initial. He had begun sending money. The first month it had been $100. By the second year, it had been $500. He had paid for Ruth's heating bills, the boys' medical bills, the boys' school clothes, the boys' first bicycle, the boys' college tuition. He had sent every dollar of his real raises and a third of every bonus he had ever received. He had hidden the money in the storage rent line of their joint budget and in a separate freelance account she had never thought to ask about. "I'm not asking you to forgive me, Margaret," the last page said. "I do not deserve that, and I never did. But I am asking you not to let it stop. The boy is a man now. He has a family. If anything happens to me, please find a way to keep the help going until Ruth is gone. After that, do what you think is right. I love you. I am sorry. I have been sorry every single day." Margaret folded the letter in half. She folded it again. She did not cry yet. She was not ready to cry yet. She was in a place beyond crying, a place where the light is very flat and the air is very still. If you are still with me, if this story is hitting you the way it hit me when I first read about it, hit that subscribe button so I can keep telling you ones like this. It takes 1 second, and it tells me you want the rest. She picked up the leather wallet. She turned it over in her hands. It was Thomas Garvey's wallet. Harold had carried it for 40 years. Margaret did not sleep that night either. She lay on her side of the bed, and she stared at the ceiling. She thought about every quiet moment of her marriage. Every Sunday morning. Every birthday cake. Every time Harold had reached for her hand in the car on a long drive. None of it had been a lie. All of it had been a lie. Both of those things were true, and she did not know how to hold them at the same time. She made a decision at 4 in the morning. She got up, packed a small overnight bag, and wrote a short note to Joanne that said only, "I need a day or two. Don't worry. Mom." She drove north at sunrise. 3 hours up the highway, past 3 exits she had never taken, into a small town with a single stoplight and a coffee shop on the corner. Cedar Junction. The address from the envelopes was on a side street called Mill Lane. The house was small and yellow with white shutters. A wooden ramp led up to the front porch. She sat in her car across the street for almost an hour. She watched a woman with white hair come out and put a small bag of trash by the curb. The woman moved slowly, but she moved on her own. She wore a blue cardigan and slippers. Margaret recognized the shape of her face from the photographs she had seen the day before, even though decades had passed. Margaret got out of her car. Her legs felt heavy. She crossed the street. She walked up the wooden ramp. She knocked on the door. The woman opened it. "Yes. Are you Ruth Garvey?" The woman tilted her head. "I am. My name is Margaret Pearson. I am Harold Pearson's wife. His widow." Ruth did not move. Her face did not change. After a long moment, she opened the door wider and stepped back. "Come in," she said. "I have been wondering when you would come." The kitchen smelled like cinnamon. Ruth put a kettle on. She poured tea into 2 thick ceramic mugs. She sat down across from Margaret at a small round table. Her hands were folded in her lap. Margaret could see the years in them. Margaret was sure that Ruth could see the years in hers. "You knew," Margaret said. "I knew," Ruth nodded. "I figured it out by 1989. The money started a few weeks after Tom died. It was anonymous, but it was too steady and too kind to be a charity. I hired a private investigator one time, just for 2 days. I gave him the postmark on the envelopes. He found the post office box. He gave me the name on the box. Age. Pearson. You never told the police." "No. Why not?" Ruth looked at her tea for a long time. "I thought about it. I thought about it for years. But by then, the money was paying for our son's medication. He had asthma. Bad asthma. And if I had turned in Mr. Pearson, the money would have stopped. And I had no idea what would have happened then. I made a deal with myself. I would let it continue. I would not let David know. I would not ever spend a single dollar on anything that was not for the boy. I kept that deal. I kept it for 40 years. Margaret looked at her. She did not know what to say. "And before you ask," Ruth said, "yes, I hated him. I hated him for a long time. I would lie in bed at night, and I would imagine knocking on his door and ruining his life the way he had ruined mine. But then the rent was paid and David got new shoes, and I would think, what good would it do? What good? I think I forgave him sometime in the 90s. I am not sure of the date. I think it was the day my son got into college." Margaret swallowed. Her throat hurt. "David found out," she said. "Recently. There were letters." Ruth nodded again. "He always knew that someone was helping us. He started asking the right questions a couple of years ago, when his own son was old enough to ask why we had been all right. I sat him down last year. I told him almost everything. I did not tell him your husband's first name. I wanted him to choose what to do with that when he was ready. He wrote to my husband 4 months ago. He wanted to meet him." "I know," Ruth said. "Harold wrote back. Said he was sick. Said he would come up here when he was strong enough." She paused. "Was he strong enough?" "No," Margaret said. "He never got strong enough." Ruth nodded again. Her eyes filled. She did not wipe them. "I am sorry for your loss, Mrs. Pearson. I mean that. Margaret. Please. Margaret. I am sorry." For a while, neither of them spoke. The kettle ticked as it cooled. A clock in the next room counted seconds. Outside, a dog barked twice and stopped. "He lives next door," Ruth said finally. "My son. David. He is at work right now, but he will be home at 5. If you want to wait." "If you do not want to wait, I will tell him you came." "I will wait," Margaret said. She sat in Ruth's living room for the rest of the afternoon. They did not talk much. They drank tea. Ruth put on a small lamp when the light dimmed. At 5:30, Margaret heard a car pull into the driveway next door. She heard a door close. She heard footsteps on a porch. She heard a man whistling something that might have been an old country song. She stood up. Her legs were steady. "I am ready," she said. David Garvey was 44 years old. He had his mother's chin and his father's height, or what Margaret guessed his father's height had been from the police photographs in Harold's lockbox. He wore work boots and a denim jacket. He had a kind, tired face. He stood in his mother's doorway and listened while Ruth told him who Margaret was, and his expression went from confusion to recognition to something quieter than either. He invited her inside his own house. The kitchen there smelled like soap and coffee. There was a child's drawing on the refrigerator. A small dog wagged at Margaret's shoes and then lay down by the radiator. Margaret put a folder on his table. It was the photo album from the storage unit. He opened it. He turned the pages slowly. He did not say anything until the very last page. "That is my graduation," he said. "I did not know anyone had taken that from far away." "He was there," Margaret said. "He stood in the back." He drove 3 hours up and 3 hours back the same day. David closed the album. He put both his hands on the cover. He looked at her. "I do not know how to feel about him," he said. "I do not either," Margaret said. They sat in silence. The dog snored softly. "I have his confession," she said at last. "It is in my car. He wrote it the night it happened. He wanted you and your mother to have it if you wanted it. If you do not want it, I will burn it." David thought about that. He looked through the kitchen window at the small backyard, where a swing set stood under a maple tree. His own son was at his grandmother's house next door. The boy was 8 years old. The boy was named Thomas, after the grandfather he had never met. "I want it," David said. "I want to read it once. Then I want to put it away. I do not want to give it to my son." "Not yet." "That sounds right," Margaret said. She went out to her car. She brought back the 4-page letter, the small black notebook, and the leather wallet that had belonged to his father. She put them on the table. She did not stay while he opened the wallet. She walked back next door to Ruth's house. She sat with Ruth in the living room and drank a third cup of tea. After a while Ruth said, "He was a good father, you know." "My Tom. He was a good father for 4 years. Some children never get that much." "My husband loved you both," Margaret said carefully. "He did not deserve to. But he did." "I know," Ruth said. "I am sorry, Margaret. For all of it. So am I." Margaret drove home the next morning. The road south was empty. The fields beyond the highway were brown and soft in the early spring sun. She drove slowly. She thought about a lot of things, and she also thought about almost nothing. She got home at noon. Joanne was sitting on the porch worried, but Margaret hugged her and said only, "I am all right, honey. I will tell you when I am ready." She went back to the storage unit one more time the next week. She brought boxes of her own. She emptied the lockbox. She kept the confession. She took the photo album back to David. She took most of the letters from Ruth to a fireplace in her own living room, and she burned them, one by one, while a small fire popped and snapped. She did not feel triumphant. She did not feel cleansed. She felt like a woman doing what needed to be done. She set up a transfer with the bank. $87 a month to Ruth Garvey for as long as Ruth was alive. After that, $300 a month into a college fund for a boy named Thomas. The bank clerk asked her how long to keep that one going. She said, "Until he turns 18, and 1 extra year after that, just in case he needs it." She closed out the storage unit. Earl in the maintenance uniform helped her load the last of the boxes into a dumpster. He did not ask questions. She did not offer answers. She paid him for the next month in cash as a tip. He tried to give it back. She made him take it. When she got home, she sat at her kitchen table. She took off her wedding ring. She turned it slowly in the light from the window. The gold was thin, where it had rubbed against his hand for 50 years. She thought about all the small kindnesses that had filled their marriage. The thermos he had filled for her every morning. The bird feeder he had refilled all winter. The way he had reached for her hand in the car on long drives, every single time. She put the wedding ring back on. She kept the lockbox. It was empty now. She took it home in the trunk of her car, and she set it on the floor of the den. She put a houseplant on top of it. A small green one with broad leaves. She watered it on Sundays. Margaret was 72 years old. She had loved a man for 50 years. She did not know him as well as she had thought, and she did not know him as poorly as she had feared. Both of those things would be true for the rest of her life. She made her peace with that slowly, the way a person makes their peace with weather. She still missed him. She still loved him. She also lived every day with the new shape of him in her memory. Her hands were not shaking anymore. She breathed easy.